Welcome to Mechanics Design 101, where we look at the history of a particular mechanic to see the costs and benefits of every iteration. Whether you're a budding game designer or merely interested in learning how different games operate, this series is for you. This week we are tackling resource management, the nature of finite versus infinite resources, and how this seemingly simple decision can have massive ramifications for gameplay and player behavior. To begin, we need to ask the question, is there a finite amount of a particular resource? If yes, how limited is it? And if not, are there any other complications to obtaining more? Health is a seemingly basic example of a technically finite resource common across most games. If a unit runs out of health, they are removed from play in some way. But health can be more or less infinite based on how it regenerates. If health regenerates naturally, or you have skills or locations that provide passive regeneration, then health is effectively infinite with a limit based on time and a max amount you can have at once. If you do not have infinite restoration available, or have a finite time frame in which to complete objectives, then your health is more truly a finite resource. In strategy games with resource collection, your sources may be finite, infinite, or metered as well. Games like Total Annihilation or Advance Wars have no limit on the overall amount of resources that can be generated in most maps. Instead, they limit your collection rate based on how many buildings you have which generate those resources. Other games may have resources that are technically infinite but have fall-off points, like StarCraft Brood War's Vespene, which mines at 1/4 the rate from a depleted geyser, or Age of Empires 2's Gold, which can be passively generated from captured relics or trade, but is limited on the map itself. Truly finite resources also exist, sometimes alongside infinite ones. Minerals in StarCraft are often far more common than Vespene, but if you run out of minerals on a map, there are no ways to get any more. Strategy games aren't the only games that can feature constant resource management. On a more basic level, money and experience in many RPGs can either be finite or infinite. Fire Emblem Shadows of Valentia has rate-limited gold and silver marks, where progressing through the game will provide them at a much faster rate, but you can always cut grass in dungeons or gather coral to trade at painfully slow rates if you run out. You use these marks to upgrade weapons, and you find weapons over the course of the game. So while it may be tempting to dump all your marks as soon as you get them, you might also want to save them to upgrade later weapons. Dark Deity is a similar game with a fully limited amount of gold available, but instead of coming in big occasional chunks with open grinding for small amounts, it comes as a regular drip, with more gold received the faster you clear each map, plus gold or sellable items from side objectives. Despite gold being a finite resource, because there are few reasons to save your gold since the same items can be bought and used from the first base all the way in through endgame, the player is encouraged to spend all their gold every time they receive more to make the next map easier, to get more gold from it, to repeat the process. Nothing saved, nothing wasted, and the only real management decisions being what you're willing to sell to buy more upgrade tokens or stat boosters. Experience can also be a resource, and Fire Emblem can be notorious for this. In many Fire Emblem games, there is a finite amount of experience in existence, leading players to play in ways to collect as much of it as possible. There are also rate limits, as higher level units earn less experience for most actions than lower level units can, with the ultimate limit being a level cap which prevents a unit from ever gaining more experience. This interplay between wanting to level up and promote to gain more power, but wanting to use lower level units to maximize experience gain, creates a dynamic where the solution to every map, for many players, is not simply finishing the objectives, but by optimizing or de-optimizing their play to gain as much experience as possible. This can lead to the biggest trap of player behavior in any game with a limited resource system: hoarding. If any item or resource has a known or perceived finite limit, then many players will be incredibly hesitant to use any of them under the assumption of, what if I need this later? The honest answer for the majority of games is that the player won't need any one specific resource later, and instead they should use it where they find most helpful. But that answer cannot be simply told to the player and have them believe it, because of the small minority of games that do require optimal resource management, and if anything are built upon that very premise. Many board games, for instance, are played best when you can perfectly use all of your resources with nothing left in excess and nothing left wanting, but most video games are not looking for that strict board game management experience, at least without the game explicitly telling them. Player over-conservatism is a mental block against consuming anything that is perceived to be limited in favor of falling back on infinite sources, even at severe detriment to the effectiveness and fun. This can range from players not wanting to use the Antarctic wind against the Djinn in Final Fantasy III's Sealed Cave, one of the most clear and obvious consumable item solutions in any game that I've played, to more extreme examples, like players who refuse to use any consumables at all, buyable or not. There are players of Diablo 2, like myself when I was young, who refuse to drink potions except as a last resort, and refuse to use town portals because scrolls are consumable. Instead, they just walk back to town every time they run low on health or mana. These players are not having a good time despite everything in the game trying to tell them that using these consumables will help so much. Ultimately, a player taking this extreme of a route does need to just discover on their own the power of using consumables. Two of the possible design side solutions to player conservatism are to either make everything effectively infinite, often with rate limits, or to make everything finite but plentiful. Each one has their drawbacks. Breath of the Wild is a game where every weapon, except bombs and physics, is finite, and extremely so. Even the Master Sword, while technically infinite in the long term, has a limited amount of use it can see before needing to recharge. The intention behind this was to make weapons very common to compensate, encouraging players to use whatever they want and find more later. The pain point this created in many players, however, was that once they found a weapon they liked, many players would deliberately avoid using it, saving it for a more challenging encounter, and instead suffering with weak or undesirable weapons, or avoiding combat entirely because it felt like a waste. Making everything infinite use removes many aspects of resource management from the game, though some can still exist. In Fire Emblem Fates or Engage, while weapons themselves are infinite use, you still have to pay for each weapon, plus its upgrades or the like, and manage which of your units has which weapon, which still creates management tasks for the player. The downside of this is that you force all accessible weapons to permanently be compared to each other, drastically reducing the useful of any non-meta weapons, and often pushing weapons to be either significantly reduced in power, limited in who can use them, or pushed back for later than they might otherwise be available in a more finite use system to compensate for their relative power to other options. Infinite use with rate limits tends to be the direction for many magical spells and items, and it works fairly well, but again, it creates a different sort of mentality in players that's often diametrically opposed to the mentality of fully finite resources. For instance, consider the 5th edition D&D design for magic wands to, say, 2nd edition. In 2nd edition, you might get a wand with a large number of charges, like 100 lightning bolts. Once you use every single charge, that wand is done, and there are no ways to recharge it. As an added twist, the players might not even know how many charges are left without a high-level identify spell. This often creates a situation in which many players are unwilling to use the wand at all, saving it for a desperate situation. The DM might respond by making increasingly desperate situations which are perfect for the wand until the players finally use it, but a designer for a static game, like a video game, cannot usually manage their players on a personal encounter-by-encounter basis. 5th edition wands, on the other hand, have a much smaller number of max charges, but regain a small number every in-game day. This triggers resource-conservative players in the opposite direction, encouraging them to use the wand every day to avoid overcapping and wasting potential charges. This will usually result in fewer potential wand spells being used over the length of the campaign when compared to the 2nd edition design, except in the case of exceedingly long campaigns spanning several years, in which case the 5th edition wand is just a new permanent spell slot, as well as far less potential uses for a single massive encounter. However, the adjustment was made to get players to be willing to use the wand in the first place, and it works, almost to the point of excess, where some players will just blast out charges without need because they know they'll get them back tomorrow. While resource over-conservatism is a common problem modern developers are keenly aware of, some players have the opposite problem, using every single item or spending all their money as soon as they get it, and constantly feeling like they're running out of resources. This liberal overuse of resources, in many ways, is a more difficult problem to solve, as so many games at the time are doing so much to fight overly conservative player behavior that using the traditional setup of limited resources being presented at an uncommon rate is no longer effective encouragement to conserve resources. Instead, you will need to find ways to directly tell players to think twice before using things, without creating a situation where players either ignore the advice entirely or become so afraid of using anything that they fall back into overconservatism. XCOM Enemy Unknown tried using Valen's voice warnings to tell players to avoid using explosives to finish off enemies, as that destroys items that could be used for research, production, or sold for cash. But a fear of using explosives puts the lives of all your soldiers on the line, usually a far more important resource than a few allies or a bit of cash, so Valen's advice often gets ignored, memed on, and mocked by veteran players. The real beast you have to manage is player tendency, and over time, those tendencies change. As of this recording, the popular trend in modern games is to remove any long-term limits or cordon them off into harder difficulties because the average player mentality has adjusted to become more liberal with their resources, using them on a whim and expecting to get more later. This is in contrast to the average player behavior from a few years ago, which was incredibly conservative, often because games at the time used limited resources as a primary difficulty valve, like screen clear bombs in an arcade shooter, or highly limited resources in some strategy game campaigns. I cannot say which way the pendulum will shift to in the future, but whether you want resource management to be a key part of your game, or whether you want players to use every item as soon as they get it, it's important to try to set that expectation with your players early. Explain to them how often to expect certain types of items, set up rewarding situations for using them, or set up small but noticeable punishments for not having them on hand, and do all of this early to make sure your players know how you expect them to use their resources. And then, expect them to do something you never predicted, because that's just how players are. Thank you so much for watching. A big shout out to Royal Lagoosguard member Sal Mellon, and Lagoosguard members C2 Peekly, Enigmatic Mr. L, The Big Herman 007, Bro Duderman, Kumi, Miss Mesmerism, Relaz6, and Lacag for joining the channel. Thank you, this is Mithril Zenith signing out.